Silence on the road. The night was heavy with quiet. Los Angeles streets, usually filled with rushing cars and glowing signs, felt strangely empty. In that silence sat Keanu Reeves, alone in his parked car, staring at the city lights as if searching for answers hidden behind the skyline. He had just left a small gathering, but he had spoken almost nothing during the evening. His silence was not just about being shy. It was the silence of a man carrying questions he could not easily voice. Keanu had lived through fame, through heartbreak, through the weight of people expecting him to always be the calm, kind soul the world admired. But tonight, his silence was heavier than usual. It was not sadness in its usual form, but a restless searching, as if he was waiting for something, someone, to break through the walls he had built inside himself. At the same time, far across town, Joe Rogan was finishing a late podcast recording. The studio lights had been turned off and the crew had gone home. Joe, with his restless energy, often took late-night drives when he needed to clear his head. He had no plan for where he was going, only a desire to breathe under the night sky. Fate is strange. It does not knock on the door, it just places two people on the same road. Joe saw a familiar figure sitting quietly in a car near the edge of a diner parking lot. The man's head was tilted slightly down, his face half lit by the orange glow of the street lamp. Joe slowed his car, and in that instant recognized him. Keanu Reeves, sitting alone in complete silence, as if the world had stopped spinning around him. Joe could have kept driving, but something about that quiet image pulled him back. He parked. Beside Keanu stepped out and walked slowly over. "Hey, man," Joe said gently, his voice carrying no judgment, only curiosity. "Are you all right?" Keanu looked up, his eyes calm but filled with unspoken weight. He gave a small smile, the kind that tries to reassure others even when the heart feels uncertain. "Just sitting," he whispered, almost as if talking too. Loud would disturb the fragile peace he was holding on to. There was a long pause. Joe was not used to silence. He was a man of words, of questions, of energy. But standing next to Keanu, he realized this was not ordinary silence. It was the kind that demanded respect. It was the kind that carried stories deeper than any conversation. Joe leaned on the car door and said, "Want to take a ride? Sometimes the road has a way of answering questions we don't even know we're asking." Keanu studied him for a moment. He could have refused. He could have chosen to stay in the stillness. But there was something sincere in Joe's eyes, a quiet kindness hidden beneath his bold personality. Keanu nodded softly. Within minutes, the two men were driving down an open highway, the city shrinking behind them. The hum of the engine filled the space where words could have been, but Keanu remained silent. Joe glanced at him a few times, curious, but he did not push. Instead, he let the silence breathe, respecting it like one respects a sacred space. Finally, after miles of nothing but headlights and shadows, Joe broke the quiet. "You know," he said, "people think silence means emptiness. But I think silence is where we meet ourselves. Maybe that's what you're doing tonight." Keanu turned his head slowly, his expression softening. For the first time that night, his silence shifted, not gone, but lighter, as if Joe's words had reached a place inside him he did not expect anyone to see. The car rolled on, the road stretching endlessly before them. Two men, different in so many ways, were bound in that moment by something rare: respect, patience, the understanding that sometimes what a person needs is not advice, not noise, but the company of someone who does not demand answers. As the clock pushed closer to midnight, Joe guided the car toward the quiet hills overlooking the city. The view was breathtaking, millions of lights shimmering like stars fallen onto Earth. Keanu leaned back, breathing deeply. For the first time in hours, He whispered words that carried more meaning than long speeches. "This is peace." Joe nodded, not with pride, but with the humble recognition that sometimes the simplest act, offering a ride, can give someone exactly what they need. And so began a journey neither of them had planned. A ride through silence, respect, and the search for something deeper than words. The car moved smoothly along the winding road, the hum of the engine echoing like a heartbeat in the stillness of the night. Joe Rogan kept his hand steady on the wheel, glancing now and then at Keanu, who sat beside him like a man caught between worlds. There was something powerful in the way Keanu remained silent. Most people filled space with words, afraid of pauses. But Keanu's silence was not emptiness. It was full, like a river that ran deep below the surface, holding memories, regrets, and reflections that words could never capture. As they climbed higher into the hills, the city lights shimmered below, like scattered jewels. Joe tried to keep the moment simple, but curiosity began to stir inside him. He knew silence had its purpose, but he also sensed a story waiting to break free. "People think you're unshakable," Joe said, his voice low but steady. "They see you in movies, interviews, red carpets. They think you've got it all figured out. But I don't buy it. I think there's more to you than anyone knows." Keanu turned his head slightly. The faintest smile crossed his lips, not of joy, but of recognition. "Everyone has more than they show," he whispered, his tone like a gentle truth carried on the wind. Those words hung between them like a secret shared. Joe didn't push further, but his mind was alive with questions. What was Keanu holding back? What had weighed on him so heavily that even in a crowded room earlier that night, he chose silence over speech? A flashback filled Keanu's mind. Moments from earlier that evening replayed in his thoughts. Laughter around a dinner table, people talking loudly, and the unshakable sense that he didn't belong. He had smiled, nodded, and listened, but inside, he felt distant. The noise of the world had become too much, and silence had felt safer than pretending. Back in the car, Joe kept the road steady. "You know," he said after a long pause, "silence can be strength, but it can also be a cage. Sometimes we sit so long with our thoughts that they start to feel heavier than they really are. I've seen fighters, comedians, even friends break under that kind of weight." Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, letting the truth of those words wash over him. He wasn't offended, nor did he resist. Instead, he allowed himself to feel it. He thought about the years he had spent carrying, losses that never fully healed, the deaths, the heartbreaks, the loneliness. He had learned to live with them, but sometimes they returned stronger, like shadows creeping back into light. Sensing the heaviness, Joe turned the radio on, but not to fill space. He played something soft, almost like background breathing, instrumental, music that carried no words, only tones that matched the rhythm of the night. Keanu opened his eyes and looked at Joe. "You talk a lot," he said gently, a hint of warmth breaking through his calm face. Joe chuckled. "Yeah, guilty. I make a living running my mouth. But tonight feels different. Maybe it's not about words. Maybe it's about hearing what's not being said." That line caught Keanu's attention. It reminded him of something his mother once told him: "The most honest truths are spoken without words." It was advice he had carried for years, but rarely did anyone else seem to understand. And now, here was Joe, a man known for endless conversations, admitting that silence might hold more power than talking. Suddenly, an unexpected moment broke the calm. The car rounded a curve and a stray dog darted across the road. Joe slammed, the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. Both men lurched forward, the seatbelts catching them just in time. The car stopped inches from the frightened animal, which stood frozen in the headlights. Joe cursed under his breath, gripping the wheel tight. But Keanu's reaction was different. He opened the door slowly, stepped out, and walked toward the trembling dog. Under the street lamp, Keanu knelt down, his movements calm and deliberate. The dog growled at first, but his gentle presence disarmed the fear. He didn't rush, didn't demand trust. He simply waited, silent and patient. Within moments, the dog's growl softened, and it allowed him to touch its head. Joe watched from inside the car, stunned by what he was seeing. It wasn't just about calming a dog. It was about the way Keanu approached life, with patience, with humility, with kindness that asked for nothing in return. When Keanu returned to the car, Joe shook his head in disbelief. "Man, you didn't just calm that dog. You calmed me. You didn't even say a word, but that moment—" Joe stopped, his voice trailing off, almost choked with emotion. "You made me feel something I can't explain." Keanu gave a small smile, his eyes reflecting the lights of the city below. "Sometimes silence speaks louder than noise," he said softly. The ride continued, but something had shifted. The silence was no longer heavy. It was alive, carrying unspoken respect between two men who saw the world in very different ways, yet found common ground in the stillness of the night. And as the road stretched endlessly before them, Joe realized something he hadn't before. Maybe tonight wasn't about giving Keanu a ride to peace. Maybe it was about learning that peace was not something you gave. It was something you shared. The night was no longer silent in the same way. After the near collision with the stray dog, the air inside Joe's car carried a strange mix of calm and intensity. The headlights stretched far into the dark road, but both men knew that what they had just experienced was not only about saving an animal. It was about facing something within themselves, how fragility and strength lived side by side. Keanu sat with his gaze fixed on the road ahead, but his mind drifted inward. For years he had been known as the man who survived storms with dignity. Yet here he was, still questioning, still wrestling with unspoken wounds. Joe, on the other hand, felt like he had stepped into someone else's rhythm. He was used to controlling conversations, steering them like a fighter in the ring. But with Keanu, the silence was steering him, teaching him lessons he had never planned to learn. "You didn't even flinch back there," Joe finally said, breaking the quiet. "Most people would have panicked, shouted, cursed, but you walked out like you were meeting an old friend." Keanu turned slightly, his voice low but steady. "Fear doesn't need more fear. Sometimes it only needs patience." Those words dug deep into Joe's chest. He thought of all the times he had reacted with fire to fire, on stage, on podcasts, even in life. He was a man who pushed, confronted, argued. Yet here was Keanu, showing that strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered. To change the mood, Joe pulled off the main road and stopped at a lookout point. The city stretched below them like a sea of stars, endless and glittering, while the hills stood like quiet guardians of the night. Both men stepped out of the car. The cool breeze brushed against their faces, carrying the faint scent of pine and asphalt. For a long moment, they stood side by side without speaking, two silhouettes against the glowing horizon. Joe, restless by nature, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Keanu, still and rooted, seemed almost like part of the night itself. Then, almost unexpectedly, Joe said, "You ever feel like the world only wants a version of you? Like they take the part they like and forget the rest?" Keanu's eyes remained fixed on the horizon. "All the time," he replied. "They want the smile, the calm, the story of kindness. But they forget the silence, the grief, the loneliness. Those don't make headlines. Those don't sell tickets." That raw honesty hung heavy in the air. Joe had asked the question half expecting a vague answer, but what he got was something deeper, something real. "And what do you do with that?" Joe pressed. Keanu breathed deeply, his shoulders rising and falling. "You accept it. You give them what they want, but you keep the rest safe inside you, not because it's shameful, but because not everyone is ready to understand it. Joe turned toward him, his eyes wide. For once, the man who always had a quick reply found himself speechless. Keanu's words carried a weight that needed no argument, no debate. They were not just words of an actor. They were words of a man who had lived long with both adoration and loss. And then came the twist neither of them expected. From behind them, in the shadows of the trees, came the sound of footsteps. Both men turned quickly. A figure emerged. An older man, thin and weary, dressed in clothes that looked worn by the years. He carried a small bag slung over his shoulder and paused under the dim light of the street lamp near the lookout. The stranger's face was lined with stories untold. His eyes met theirs, and for a moment, silence returned. Different from before, sharper, edged with mystery. Joe instinctively stepped forward, cautious. "Hey, you okay, man?" he asked. The old man gave a faint smile, his voice rough but kind. "Funny thing," he said, "I wasn't planning to stop here. But something told me I should." Keanu studied him, his calm gaze never breaking. There was something in the man's presence, something familiar, almost like a reflection of his own silence. The stranger walked closer, setting down his bag. "You two look like you're carrying questions," he said softly. "Mind if I sit? Without hesitation?" Keanu nodded. Joe, though skeptical, didn't object. And so, on that quiet hilltop, 3 men sat together, 2 known by millions, and 1 unknown to anyone but himself. The old man began to speak, telling fragments of his story. He had once been a musician, traveling from place to place, playing songs that never became hits. He had loved, lost, and wandered. He talked of silence, too, how he had learned to carry it not as a burden, but as a companion. Joe listened with curiosity, while Keanu listened with recognition. The man's story was not identical to his, but the echoes were the same. Loss, endurance, humility, and the strange way silence could break or save you. At one point, the stranger looked at Keanu directly. "People see you, but they don't see you. I don't need to know your name to know that. Silence is written in your eyes. But silence, my friend, is not the end. It is the beginning of something greater, if you let it speak." Keanu felt a chill run through him. Not from the cold, but from the way a stranger could mirror truths he had guarded for years. Joe glanced between them, realizing this night was turning into something he could never have scripted. What started as a car ride was becoming a journey into hidden corners of the human spirit. The 3 sat for what felt like hours, the city below unaware of the quiet exchange happening above. And as dawn began to touch the edges of the horizon, Joe knew one thing for sure. This was no ordinary night. This was a night that would change them, each in ways they could not yet see. The horizon was slowly changing, touched with pale colors of dawn, but the 3 men remained seated at the lookout. The city below glimmered with fading night lights, and the silence between them was no longer empty. It was alive, like a 4th companion listening to everything unsaid. Joe Rogan, who was always the one to lead conversations, found himself quieter than ever before. Keanu Reeves, who had carried silence as a shield, was opening pieces of himself in ways he didn't expect. And the stranger, the old man with tired clothes and gentle eyes, seemed to hold wisdom carved from years of wandering. It was the stranger who broke the silence first. "You know," he said, his voice rough yet steady, "the world doesn't ask who you really are. It asks who you can pretend to be, and the stronger the mask, the more applause you get." Joe's chest tightened. He had built his life with words, laughter, debates, and arguments. But here, under the breaking dawn, he wondered how much of it was mask, and how much was real. Keanu, listening intently, felt the words dig into old wounds. The mask of kindness he carried was genuine, yet also incomplete. People admired him for his calm presence, but they rarely saw the storms he had weathered alone. The stranger continued, "I played music for years. People clapped when I played what they wanted to hear, but they walked away when I played what was inside my soul. It took me years to learn this. Applause doesn't mean understanding. Sometimes it means they never really listened." Joe exhaled. Slowly, his usual sharpness replaced by thoughtfulness. "So what do we do then? Keep wearing the mask or risk being ignored?" The stranger smiled faintly. "Neither. You carry both. The mask is for the world, but the truth is for you. And for those rare souls who are strong enough to see it without turning away." Keanu's eyes softened. It reminded him of the stray dog on the road earlier that night. The world would have turned away, fearful or annoyed, but patience had revealed trust. Maybe people were the same. Maybe silence and truth were not meant for everyone, but for those who stayed, who didn't run from the heaviness. Suddenly, a gust of wind swept through the hilltop, scattering dust and making Joe shiver slightly. He pulled his jacket tighter, and in that moment he realized something unusual. He wasn't thinking about the next question to ask or the next story to tell on his show. He was simply being. Something rare for him. Keanu finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "You remind me of someone," he said to the stranger. "Someone who once told me that the hardest part of life is not the pain itself, but learning to carry it without letting it poison your kindness." The stranger nodded knowingly. Then that someone was wise. Joe leaned back against the car, letting the conversation sink into him. But a sudden thought crossed his mind. "Hey, I don't even know your name," he said, turning toward the man. The old man chuckled softly. "Names are for the world. You don't need mine. What you need is to remember what this night gave you." Joe wasn't satisfied with that answer, but something in the man's tone told him to let it be. For a while, they all watched the sunrise. The golden light crept across the city, washing away the darkness. It felt symbolic, like the night itself had been a test, and now the morning carried its reward. Keanu closed his eyes briefly, feeling warmth on his face, and in that moment, he allowed himself something rare. The thought that maybe he was not as alone as he often believed. But just as peace began to settle, the stranger added a final twist. "Be careful," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Silence is a gift, but it can also be a prison. I've seen men who hid in it so long they forgot how to be seen. Don't let that happen to either of you." His words landed like thunder, beneath the calm. Joe glanced at Keanu, almost startled by the sharpness of the warning. Keanu, however, didn't flinch. He nodded slowly, as if the stranger had only confirmed something he already knew, but rarely admitted aloud. The old man stood, slung his bag over his shoulder, and without another word, began walking down the hill, his figure growing smaller with every step. Neither Joe nor Keanu stopped him. There was no need. He had given them what he came to give. Joe broke the silence first, his voice low. "That was unreal. Like he knew us without even knowing us." Keanu kept his gaze on the path where the man had disappeared. "Sometimes strangers see more clearly than friends," he murmured. Joe shook his head slowly, almost laughing at the strangeness of it all. "Man, I thought I was giving you a ride tonight, but now it feels like we both got pulled into something bigger than us." They got back into the car, but the energy had shifted. Joe was no longer just the driver, and Keanu was no longer just the passenger. They were two men walking a path neither had expected, guided not by plans, but by silence, by fate, and by the mysterious presence of a stranger whose name they would never know. As Joe started the engine, Keanu looked out at the brightening sky. The road ahead was no longer just asphalt and turns. It was a journey of understanding, of respect, humility, resilience, and the quiet ways people touch each other's lives. And as they rolled back onto the highway, Joe realized something powerful. Silence didn't mean the absence of a story. Sometimes silence was the story, waiting for the right moment to be heard. The car rolled slowly back down from the hills, the sunlight now stretching across the sky in soft streaks of gold and pink. But inside Joe's car, the silence returned, once more, not heavy, not empty, but thoughtful. It was the kind of silence that comes after a storm, when both the sky and the soul are trying to make sense of what just happened. Joe tapped his fingers lightly on the steering wheel, his restless energy showing, but for once he didn't break the silence with his usual flood of words. He kept glancing at Keanu, curious, almost impatient, yet respectful enough to wait. Keanu, on the other hand, looked calm, his face carrying the weight of reflection. Finally, Joe spoke, his voice quiet but edged with intensity. "You know, man, that stranger? It felt like he knew things about us we never said out loud, like he saw something we've been hiding even from ourselves." Keanu's lips curved in the faintest smile, not of joy, but of agreement. Sometimes, silence reveals more than speaking ever could. He didn't need to know us. He just recognized the silence in us because it lived in him too. Joe gripped the wheel tighter. He wasn't used to being the one who felt lost for words. "I'll be real with you," he admitted. "I talk for a living. I debate. I argue. I joke. I dig into people's lives. But tonight, I don't even know what to say. I feel like I'm standing in front of something bigger than words." Keanu turned his head, his eyes calm but piercing. "Then maybe you're finally hearing what silence sounds like." That line hit Joe harder than he expected. He laughed softly, shaking his head. "Man, you're killing me. I thought I was giving you a ride, but it feels like you've been driving the whole time without even touching the wheel." The road stretched endlessly ahead, but something about the moment carried tension, as if a deeper truth was waiting to break through. Keanu leaned back, his gaze fixed on the passing trees. Then, almost out of nowhere, he began to speak, not with hesitation, but with a steady flow, like water finally breaking through a dam. "I've lived with silence for years," Keanu said, his tone low but filled with weight. "People see me on screens, smiling, calm, humble. They think I've mastered peace. But what they don't see are the nights when silence was my only companion, when grief felt like a shadow that never left. I learned to live with it. But sometimes, I wonder if silence is my strength, or if it's my cage." Joe froze for a moment, his chest tightening. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the unmasking of a man the world thought they knew. Keanu continued, his words cutting deeper. "I lost people I loved. I lost dreams I once held close. Every time silence was there. Sometimes it healed me, sometimes it broke me. I carry it like a friend and an enemy at the same time. That's what you saw tonight. Not peace, not calm, just silence holding me together when I don't know what else will." Joe's throat felt dry. He wanted to reply, but nothing came. Instead, he felt something shift inside him. Respect, not for the celebrity sitting next to him, but for the human being who had just laid his truth bare. To steady himself, Joe pulled the car over near a small roadside cafe. The place was quiet, with only a few early risers sipping coffee inside. He killed the engine and turned to face Keanu. "You know what, man? I get it now. Silence isn't weakness. It isn't even peace. It's resilience. It's the way you carry what would crush anyone else." Keanu looked at him, his expression calm but softened by gratitude. "And resilience doesn't always need applause," he said gently. They sat in the parked car for a while longer, watching people trickle into the cafe, each carrying their own stories, their own silences. Joe thought about his own life, the Times he had hidden behind words, the times he had avoided stillness because it scared him. Maybe that was why fate had placed him here tonight, sitting beside a man whose silence wasn't an escape, but a lesson. Then, just as Joe was about to start the engine again, a surprising moment unfolded. A little boy, no older than 10, walked past the car with his mother. The boy stopped, staring at Keanu through the window. His eyes widened in awe, but he didn't shout or call out. Instead, he simply smiled. A soft, genuine smile, as if he saw not the actor, but the man. Keanu returned the smile gently, lifting his hand in a small wave. The boy waved back, then walked on with his mother. The moment was brief, but it carried weight. Proof that sometimes recognition comes not from noise, but from quiet connection. Joe watched the exchange, shaking his head. Man, even kids get it. They don't need interviews or headlines. They just see you, and they feel it. Keanu didn't respond with words. He just sat there, eyes glimmering with something unspoken, and for Joe, that was enough. The car started again, carrying them further down the road. The day was beginning, but the journey was far from over. Something deeper still waited ahead. Something neither of them could yet name, but both of them were already walking toward. The morning sun rose higher, turning the sky into shades of soft blue and gold. The world was waking up. Cars filled the roads. People hurried along sidewalks. The hum of life returned. Yet inside Joe's car, time felt slower, as if the night they had just lived through had pulled them into another dimension. Joe drove steadily, his usual energy replaced by something quieter. Keanu sat beside him, eyes on the horizon, his silence no longer heavy but lighter, almost like a song without words. Both men felt that the journey wasn't about the miles behind them, but the truths uncovered along the way. Joe finally spoke, his voice rough with honesty. Man, I've spent years talking. I've filled hours with words, laughter, arguments. But this night, it showed me that silence can be louder than all of that. I think you just taught me something I didn't even know I needed to learn. Keanu turned slightly, his calm presence steady. I didn't teach you, he said softly. We learned together. Silence isn't mine alone. It belongs to everyone who dares to sit with it long enough to hear what it's saying. The words sank deep into Joe's chest. He had always been the one searching for answers through noise, through questions. Now he realized some answers lived only in quiet. They stopped again, this time near a lake at the edge of the city. The water shimmered under the morning light, still and reflective. Joe parked the car, and the two men stepped out. They walked to the edge of the lake, the air crisp and fresh. For a while, they simply stood there, watching the ripples move slowly across the surface. Joe broke the silence with a confession. You know, Keanu, I've been afraid of silence. It makes me feel small. Like if I sit in it too long, I'll hear things about myself I don't want to face. Keanu's eyes stayed on the water. Silence doesn't make you small, he said gently. It shows you how big your soul really is. That's why it's scary. Because it doesn't lie. It holds a mirror to everything you've been running from. Joe swallowed hard. Those words pierced him deeper than he expected. He thought of moments he had buried, times when he had doubted himself, when he had hidden behind laughter or strong opinions because the silence inside scared him. Now, standing here, he realized Keanu was right. Silence wasn't the enemy. Silence was the truth waiting patiently to be heard. As they stood there, the stranger's words from the night before echoed back. Silence is not the end. It is the beginning of something greater, if you let it speak. Joe exhaled deeply, as if releasing years of weight. Maybe this is what I needed. Maybe this is what we needed. A ride that wasn't about getting somewhere, but about slowing down enough to see where we are. Keanu finally looked at him, his eyes carrying both weariness and light. Sometimes peace isn't found in arriving. Sometimes it's found in the ride itself. Those simple words closed the circle. The night that began with heavy silence, the road that tested them, the stranger who mirrored their hidden truths, it had all led to this, a car ride not toward a destination, but toward peace. The two men stood there a while longer, letting the morning embrace them. Then, with quiet understanding, they walked back to the car. The journey wasn't over, not because more roads needed to be driven, but because life itself would continue, to test them with noise, with silence, with choices of how to carry both. Joe started the engine again, but this time, the sound of the car wasn't just a hum. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful rides are not about speed or distance. They are about presence, respect, humility, and the courage to sit in silence without fear. As the car rolled forward, Joe smiled faintly. "You know what, man? Maybe this was the best conversation I've ever had." And we barely even talked. Keanu's lips curved in a gentle smile. That's because silence had the floor tonight. They drove on, the road stretching endlessly before them, but the peace they had found would remain, carried in their hearts long after the night was gone.